detest marijuana? Or do you passionately love it? Either way, I want you to stick around and watch this video because guaranteed, you're gonna learn something. Friends, let's dig into it. Moving to Southern Missouri is the best thing I've ever done for my family. So y'all, I got some street cred for being able to talk about the marijuana industry, and that is because I am originally from Humboldt County, California. For those of you that lived a normal life, you might not know that Humboldt County is one of the epicenters of marijuana production and also the production of marijuana culture. The culture that really has spread throughout the entire world really did start in these small, often rural areas that were concentrated with hippies, and also the Back to the Land movement, which perfectly fostered huge isolated grows. As I was trying to organize this video, I realized how complex the history of marijuana is, at least pertaining to legalization. Just like we've seen in Missouri, there's always layers to the legalization process, and it always starts with medical marijuana, and then it moves on to recreational, and then after recreational, you see simultaneous growth of large-scale commercial and also large-scale black market, which usually becomes dominated by more advanced international mafias. And it just seems to be the trajectory of the marijuana industry, at least what I've seen in California. So, of course, every state is going to be a little bit different, but I do think it's important to kind of look at the states that do have those histories. So, in like the 1960s, Humboldt County, California was made of a bunch of rural towns, predominantly conservative, a lot of resource-heavy industries. So you had logging, you had a lot of lumber mills, a big portion was fishing industry. There was a lot of different types of agriculture, but I would say primarily cattle and dairies probably was like the most. But yeah, I mean, you had a lot of just really small population towns. A lot of those farms were multi-generation farms, so families that had for 3 or more generations run those cattle or those dairy operations. And honestly, it was a stark like 180 from what it is today. I share that with you really for especially the local Missourians who have no idea that that's what California once looked like. So now we're going to go back to Humboldt County and we're going to fast forward to the 1980s. And this really is the time period that I believe that the Mexican cartel really started to concentrate in the area. Ironically, I do believe that they came to the area first with invitations from the hippie growers. I'm going to tell you a story. It was told to me when I was probably 4 years old, because one thing about growing up in Humboldt is there was no filter for the children, so we were just exposed to just rampant, inappropriate sexuality, drug use, stories of heinous murder and abduction. Everything was shared with toddlers. So that is another aspect of the culture that I grew up in. But yeah, this was told to me. It was one of just being really young. I remember hearing this story, but my mom's best friend had hired what turned out to probably be Mexican cartel to help her come up and grow. And according to my mom, I don't remember her, but according to my mom, she was a really great woman. She treated her workers really, really well. She overpaid them. She helped them even wire money back to Mexico. She just did a lot of things going out of her way for them. You know, they stayed in her home and she fed them and just took care of them like they were family. And she had told my mom how wonderful they were. I mean, she had really made that connection. And the night of their biggest harvest, because there's always waves and waves of harvest in marijuana production, but the night of the biggest harvest, they beat her to death with a mag light, which is a large, heavy metal flashlight. And in such a way, it could have almost been deemed torture. And that's what we have seen with the Mexican cartels. I think are the most brutal. From my life, that is what I've seen. But there are a lot of cartels in the area. There's a lot of mafia in the area. And I'll get into itemizing that kind of as it goes on in the timeline. So I think what happened was stories started going back and forth from Humboldt County, and what they realized was that there was these massive large-scale grows being grown by a predominantly hippie population, also covert rednecks, who said they hated marijuana but were really growing it, but predominantly hippies who were open pacifists, right? Like nonviolence and no weapons, and they were easy pickings. So the stories of just brutal deaths really started to grow in the 80s as those kind of connections started to be formed, and just more and more and more illegal workers who were really cartel started to flock to Humboldt County. Because there's so much to cover, I'm going to compress some of these timelines talking about medical marijuana and then recreational marijuana, which was really the beginning of just full large-scale commercial grows, completely open, and I would say triple-fold in the public lands of illegal grows, because they were already really present. So in 1996, we had the medical marijuana bill, and that was really kind of the beginning of like it really spreading like wildfire throughout the state, because the law, of course, was written in such a way that there was kind of some confusion about really truly how much you could have, and so really I saw large grows that were even, police even came and left, you know. So yeah, I mean the lines were really blurred between medical production and commercial production at that time, and then pretty much everyone I knew had a medical prescription, but then they also had an illegal grow as well. So I also want to say something about that time, which is that I had never heard of anyone not getting their prescription from one of these medical marijuana doctors. It cost several $100s, like $200 to $400, depending on who you saw. And my doctor that I saw literally told me what to put on my prescription. He's like, it's easy to approve, like back pain and menstrual cramps. So I went, great, I've had back pain and menstrual cramps, let's put that down. So the idea that it's really centered around medicine is a tricky one. And I'm not here to offend people that do feel that they're using it for medical reasons. I just saw in my life that like all of a sudden everyone was like a wounded dog and had these like serious medical ailments that they needed marijuana for. And the truth is that the marijuana addiction in the community I came from was already well established. And so yeah, to go back to like the hippie phase too, like I said, even pre-medical marijuana, everyone was claiming it was medicine while they were partying all night long, also doing obscene amounts of cocaine, drinking, you know, just lewd living, and all the while saying it was medical. And so that was so drilled into me, I never questioned it until the last few years of living there, when my eyes were starting to open. I literally, from being just a young child all the way up into my mid-30s, I never questioned the medicinal value of marijuana. There's something else that I want to touch on during the medical marijuana phase. It is when my generation, so I'm like probably the very beginning of millennial or very end of Generation X, you know, somewhere in that millennial Generation X phase. And the marijuana industry was taken to an even darker place, honestly, than like our elders, like the hippie generation. I do want to point out a few things. We were heavily indoctrinated into rap culture, and I do think that there's something to be said about that listening repetitively to music that glorifies homicide and drug use really does beat into you, not just on a psychological level, but on a spiritual level. So saying that, there was a level of like criminality that my generation embraced that was really like the next level from the hippies, right? And my generation, no one really looked like hippies anymore. For the most part, like the locals, like the local young people all looked like gangster, kind of like hip hop, gangster rap kind of, you know, dress, demeanor, everything, right? Even like accent and vernacular. And what's interesting is like previously, everyone had like kind of like that rural redneck twang. Like there was people that had an accent that sounds actually really similar to what I hear in the South and like in Missouri. All of that accent turned into like kind of just like hip hop urban accent. So just an interesting cultural thing. So also during that time, I would say criminality changed, where it is true that the bulk of the predecessors, right, the first wave of growers were the hippies, and most of them still do not have guns to this day. A lot of them are very anti-gun. And my generation was not that way. I think too, just like fear, lots of murder, coupled with rap culture, and weapons were really, really embraced. During this period too, you saw a lot more of like the booby traps, gardens that were like almost like the Vietnam War era, just like crazy booby traps. You saw, this is the era where the number of missing persons has just went through the roof. And if you guys don't know this little bit of information, it's pretty wild. Like if you average out all of California, it's about 374 missing people per 100,000. If you just isolate Humboldt alone, which is a teeny tiny county, it's 717 missing people per 100,000. It's like double the state average in this one area. And honestly, the numbers are even way worse than that. And the reason why is because I have been told by numerous different people, there's mass graves of illegals. There's people from other places, that other states, other countries. Nobody knows that they're there, that's where they disappeared. So the numbers are through the roof. And I would say it was the era of from medical marijuana from 1996 to recreational marijuana, which was 2016. This is when we saw this next level criminality. And so I don't want to paint the picture that it's all coming from the cartels. It's not. The evil that I have experienced in Humboldt County living in the marijuana industry it's not anything you can even imagine. It is what would make a crazy horror thriller, and the stories are just over and over and over again. And so I just want to say briefly, like I have mentioned, like the Mexican cartels kept human slaves and sex slaves in cages. So did the American growers. There is even a case that was documented, 2 men brutally and enslaving a 15-year-old girl that they kept in a cage for like a year. That's just one story.
If you smoke pot, I need you to sober up for a minute and let what I just said sink in. Open your heart and mind. Focus. How do you know that your weed wasn't produced by people who are physically, financially, and sexually enslaved and tortured? The truth is, you don't.
Okay, so why did I take such a crazy amount of time to tell you the history of marijuana in California? One, because it's a story that is not really told. I've definitely not seen or heard a lot of it, and that's why on some level I was compelled to tell my story. But I have to say, here in Missouri, I do notice like a certain level of people being naive to the underbelly of the marijuana industry. I notice that people, and I think that this comes from like just kind of where Missouri's at, even though I know that there's just terrible things that happen here, and there's meth, and there's crimes against children. I mean, all of the darkness is here. But it's not here in the concentration that I have been exposed to. So there seems to be a certain level of just kind of like ignorance mixed with innocence that doesn't really understand what marijuana truly is, what it can become really anywhere. And another thing that I've noticed is that there seems to be a big denial in Missouri that cartels can be here. I really want to push back against that notion because, first of all, if you look at the middle of the country, it's incredibly like logistically important because of its central location in terms of just all of the distribution of any goods in the United States. Why do people think that drugs, weapons, and human trafficking are going to be exempt from that, from benefiting from, a place that has logistic soundness that has been proven? I mean, talk to anyone in logistics and ask them, like, hey, do you guys use Missouri as a hub? So there's that. I mean, I don't think that the middle of the country is immune to what's going on the West Coast and the East Coast. The East Coast is locked down with cartels and mafia as well. So that's something I do believe that needs to be said, is that just in a matter of a handful of years, any state can change. And I say that because I've seen it. And like I said, I saw California go from redneck ranching to brutal, just cartel run criminal rings, both local and from afar. And so it can happen anywhere. So let's pretend that the cartels are not in Missouri at all. They have no influence. I truly don't know what their influence is, but here is one way that they have seeped into any state that has dispensaries.
We are now starting to see marijuana being mixed with fentanyl in the St. Louis area, and cases of teenagers using the dangerous combo are popping up. I spoke with a WashU doctor who is seeing this firsthand. Now that recreational marijuana for those 21 years and older is legal in Missouri, a new problem is coming to light. Marijuana laced with fentanyl. Dr. Michael Wenzinger, a staff psychiatrist at Washington University and a medical doctor, doesn't want to alarm people about this, but says parents need to have it on their radar.
In my clinical practice and among some of my peers, we're seeing more kids reporting they thought they were just smoking marijuana when drug screens showed fentanyl, and they would have toxicological or medical side effects consistent with that.
Dr. Wenzinger tells me the marijuana-fentanyl mixture is very recent, and it will be interesting to see what happens as the year goes on. Overall, marijuana use among teens is up.
When it comes to teenage use of any substance, their use tends to go up when public perception of risk goes down. So it's not a surprise that we're seeing way more marijuana use.
The latest data shows 30% of 12th graders are or have used marijuana. Doctors say the general feeling is that since it's sold in dispensaries, it's safe to consume.
Just look at the amount of fentanyl that is coming from the cartels and you'll understand how much of a lockdown they have of that industry. So a lot of people, and I've heard this actually a lot in Missouri, unfortunately, as a public school teacher, I even heard this from my young 7th grade students, that the healthier alternative, like if you want to consume THC and be healthy, you should just do gummies. And first of all, I want to say that of any product, the one that has probably the highest amount of this illegal marijuana that's grown with banned toxic chemicals, even like Agent Orange, that leads to crazy human birth defects, but that also is produced with literal modern day slaves, is going to be all of the processed gummies, what's in the vapes and all of that. I mean, that is going to be the avenue for where a lot of this illegal black market marijuana is grown. And we're talking hundreds to thousands of these huge, large scale grow operations. You guys, they're not taking that weed back down to Mexico, okay? So for those of you that enjoy marijuana and still feel like there's kind of this wholesomeness about it, and that there's that it's the lesser of evils. It's clearly not as bad as alcohol, right? I want you to remember, you truly don't know what went into producing that marijuana. You truly don't know. And I want you guys to listen to this clip about what they're finding in gummies now.
New now at 5, law enforcement in Montgomery County is sounding the alarm over these THC gummies. Police say they were laced with heroin and fentanyl. and 2 people have already overdosed. According to investigators, they were sold at several Tobacco Hut stores.
I think that there's a real false belief that if you're buying marijuana in a dispensary, especially like a boutique-y, fancy schmancy dispensary, that the product that you're getting is high quality, that it's organic or at least naturally sourced, that everyone is like very affluent who grew it and worked on the crop. And that really couldn't be farther from the truth.
Hey, good morning, Mark. Yeah, so the Merced Sharers apartment in Central California made one of its biggest busts of an illegal marijuana operation in terms of marijuana seized and the individuals that were human trafficked to work on this operation. Authorities seized thousands of pounds of finished product, and upon arriving at the scene, investigators discovered 60 people working at this marijuana operation grow. And authorities say that these 60 people are victims of human trafficking and are not U.S. citizens.
I think that the processed THC products probably have the highest amount of like illegal cartel grown marijuana. And what people don't realize is that the bulk of that marijuana was produced with modern day slavery. I need to take a minute and describe to you how the different mafias and cartels appear to work. To me, what I was shown, and then also what I was directly told by different cartel and mafia members. And that's because we were neighbors. Once casual relationships were formed, people will actually tell you really a lot of information. I personally had never heard of, and another bit of information or evidence is that like I'm pretty connected with like my generation who was supportive of illegal weapons coming in, and most growers have illegal weapons that they're procuring illegally, and I would say the cartels are a primary source. No one ever talked about getting their weapons from the Mexican cartels, so I think that's important to note. I just never saw it. What I did see is that about mid 2000s, definitely before legalization, we had a huge influx of Bulgarians. It turned out the Bulgarians were actually controlled by Russian mafia. The Russian mafia, very well organized and mostly ex-military, came in through different immigration policies through the Clinton era. All of a sudden, they flooded Humboldt County, and it was just in a matter of a few years. Unlike the Mexican cartels, they were very much more brazen with their weapons. Their lands, which were bought legally, they were legal citizens at this point. They owned a lot of land, and they had snipers coming into all of that property. Everybody knew it. Some of them were, you could see them with your eyes, some of them not. Everybody knew it, and it was to the point where local law enforcement just dubbed these no-go zones. There was another portion where local law enforcement asked Homeland Security for tanks so that they could actually feel safe to go into some of these no-go zone grow areas. And they were denied those tanks. Yeah, at that time, I actually was really wanting them to get that, but I was starting to see that we were definitely being like taken over. So yeah, so the Russians are actually the ones that I first saw bringing in large quantities of guns. And I'm talking like 1,000 weapons at a time. And those would be sold, to the locals as they would get dispersed out through the cartels all over the world, really. But Humboldt County was definitely a place where, like a transition place for these weapons to come in. Russians love AK-47s, for those of you that don't know that. It's probably their weapon of choice. We would see shipments that were clearly Russian military, Russian-made, Russian military AK-47s. But then something interesting happened. Two things I want to mention. Mid-2000s, and this is coming from Russian mafia that told me this, and verified by locals, like this became just kind of common knowledge, is that there was an unspoken war in the mountains and the public lands of California. And it was the Russian mafia versus the Mexican cartels. And according to the Russians, they also I heard stories about there's a lot of unmarked graves in these public lands, a lot of mass graves in the public lands. But according to them, there was a large war, there was a lot of casualties, and at the end of that war, the Russians won. And what I would say is the story seemed believable, at least to me, because all of a sudden, what were these very powerful and very kind of brutal Mexican cartels that had been there for, like decades, they all of a sudden were very much taking their orders from the Russian mafia. It just seemed obvious to me that the Russian mafia was in power at that time. So you had the Mexican cartels, you had the Bulgarians, both being controlled by the Russian mafia. Well, then another element came in, and that was the Israelis. And I don't know if they're military or mafia, but very well organized. I was told by all sorts of people, but particularly this one who became kind of my informant in the Russian mafia, was that they had endless sources of money that he had never seen. That the Russian mafia is very well funded, and the amount of money that the Israelis have is unlike anything. Like, they can make $1 billion just appear. So I don't have any evidence other than that was just told to me. And I do have to say that once the Israelis came in, it seemed like there was a level of money and professionalism and organization that was then even another level higher than the Russian mafia. So something that I noticed a lot of new rounds of illegal weapons coming in, and this time they were US. So I have some theories. I don't have proof. Somehow they are going from the US to Israel. I don't know if that is the weapons that we're giving that is somehow ending up in these criminal elements' hands, and then they pass them on to the Russians. Russians are pushing them on to the groups they control and do business with, which is the Mexican cartels. I'm not sure. I just know that from what I've seen, the weapons that are illegal, that are US made, are coming in through the Israelis. And the Israelis now control the Russians control the Bulgarians and the Mexicans.
The Sinaloa Cartel is one of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking organizations, shipping cocaine, meth, and fentanyl around the globe. But we're not here to talk about drugs.
Tell me about the rifle that you have in front of you right now. What is it?
Es una K-47. Este rifle viene de Estados Unidos.
How do you know that?
Porque ya lo compramos.
An entire arsenal of AK-47s, AR-15s, and pistols is readily available north of the border, along with other weapons of war, like Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifles.
Are these bullets on your chest there from a Barrett?
Sí, estos son de 50. ¿Gusta verlo?
See? You can't get these in Mexico. It's hard, right?
Está muy caro, ya. Te sale mejor traerlo a Estados Unidos porque usted sabe que todo viene de allá.
If you're buying the Barrett rifle from the United States, how much does one of those cost you?
El $50 $2 millones de pesos.
Wow.
As you just watched that clip, you should be asking yourself, why would the cartel be giving this interview? What could possibly be their goal? Well, in the next clip, they pretty much show their cards.
If in the future the U.S. changes its gun laws and makes it harder, are you worried that you won't be able to get the guns you want anymore?
Pues si cambias sus leyes sí un poco, porque no voy a poder comprar un arsenal, pues.
What do you think people in the United States should know about you and your group?
Pues que nos manden más armas más buenas y aquí las calamos, estamos peleando con ellas, que todo bien, que nos manden más.
Yes, that's right. They want to disarm Americans. They want to thank us for our loose gun laws and that they're procuring all of their weapons through legal means here in the United States. Well, I hope that most of you know that that is... I almost said a bad word. That ain't true. And I want to take a little bit of time to describe to you what I saw with illegal weapons trades in Humboldt County. What you're going to see is that illegal grows have become more prolific, more toxic, more dangerous to workers than before legalized recreational marijuana. And we need to look at why that is. I want to reiterate what that clip was saying. So in 2016, when we had the legalization of recreational marijuana, we also had in that bill the decriminalization of illegal grows, which maybe theoretically sounds like a peaceful thing to do, but it ushered in a whole new wave of control of our public lands by Mexican cartels. And we're talking, you know, they say, a lot of people say hundreds, I think it's probably thousands of these large scale illegal grows. One could say that the cartels have control of the public lands in California. And that is why I talk about marijuana production being a serious threat to national security. And I hope that you guys can all see, regardless of your position on marijuana, that there is an underbelly to this industry that is so stark from kind of that cultural, we all kind of giggle when we hear the word weed, and it's like, oh, it's that funny grass, and it's just funny. Well, there is a whole other side to this, and I think it's time that we really look at it. All right, you guys, until next time, be safe, stay sober, and I'll see you next time. As always, all my information is in the description. Reach out to me whenever you need me. Bye.